Let me start by saying what a pleasure it has been to take part in this day, kicked off by Sander van der Leeuw. It was Sander who inspired me to get out into the field, to learn about pottery. I had an undergraduate dissertation to research, so I went to Pakistan to study traditional potters in the Northwest Frontier province. I managed to visit, largely by accident, some of the same potters that Owen Rye and Clifford Evans had visited some 2 decades earlier. At the time, Sander must have been writing his paper, giving the potter a choice, conceptual aspects of pottery techniques, for the volume Technological Choices, edited by Pierre Lemonnier. Looking back now, his observations remain highly salient, particularly around his unease when the description of techniques risks making the potter into a mechanic of sorts, merely navigating between different environmental constraints. I'd also like to take this opportunity to recognize the impact that Valentine Roux had on my subsequent study of Aegean wheel techniques. I remember being quite shocked at first when she suggested, during a break at a conference at Lampeter, I think, in 1999, that perhaps even conical cups may have been wheel-fashioned. This was soon after her 1998 paper with Marie-Agnès Corty. I thought it was a crazy idea, but sure enough, when I started looking, I did see some telltale signs. They're not always as easy to spot as on this example, and the traces continue to be quite hard to discern, but they frequently are present. I started to do a little experimental work to pursue this wheel fashioning idea myself, together with Sophie Méry and Véronique Dury, the latter a potter in the Bourgogne. But I rather left it at that, and Caroline took up that path, and of course has followed it most fruitfully. So I cannot really tell Caroline, and others we've heard from today, too much that they don't know already about the goal of developing a reliable, objective methodology for identifying the ways that the potter's wheel was utilized in pottery forming sequences. What I would like to try and do, however, is step back and think about some of the context that might underlie or inform such efforts. Richard Sennett, in his book The Craftsman, begins his chapter The Hand like this: technique has a bad name. It can seem soulless. That's not how people whose hands become highly trained view technique. For them, technique will be intimately linked to expression. To understand a technique mechanically, that is to say, without the expression or soul that Sennett refers to, is to capture some aspect of how the technique works. In programming a robot to play the violin, the technicians at Toyota, presumably in the process, learned quite a lot about the mechanics of violin technique. One could say that what they did was to generate a kind of model of violin playing. Models are always abstractions. They simplify and reduce real-world complexity. I imagine the Toyota team did not aim or expect to replicate a human's expressive musicality. But in seeking to approximate violin playing by focusing on the mechanical aspects, they were likely able to learn something about the limits of their methods. As George Box said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. I suggest we might think of the work we have heard about today within this theme of modes of research as model building. Let's return to this quote: reliable, objective methodology for identifying the ways that the potter's wheel was utilized in pottery forming sequences. Within the language of models, we might want to rephrase that. One can only really approximate the way the potter's wheel was used. We're only getting at the mechanical aspects. I might mention here that the whole model building enterprise is something I've thought more about in relation to networks, whereby interaction is modelled making certain assumptions about physical space. It's pretty clear that one is leaving a lot out: social, ideological and political motivations for interaction. But the hope is to capture some dimension of interaction, or, failing that, at least to understand a little better the mode of research one's engaged in. I think if we recognize that the mechanical aspects are inherently limited and in some sense empty, then we can do something useful with the results obtained. To come back to the violin-playing robot, what is it? What is this truly as a model? Is its real achievement to highlight what is lacking? To understand how robots differ from humans? Or are we just faced with an empty experiment, a gimmick that has no meaning? The risk of an empty experiment, devoid of meaning, prompts me to ask, what is missing from the mechanical assessments of wheel-making? Because if these experiments encourage us to evaluate more thoughtfully what the technique really consists of, then they have value. It is then a matter of asking not only how the model is useful, but also how it is inevitably also wrong, as all models are. And it's my sense that we're not asking this question explicitly enough. What is missing, and what is wrong in the model? Here is where we need to consider the soul and expression raised by Sennett. I have been reading recently about Chinese pottery, and particularly about wares from the Tang and Song dynasties, such as Yu Celadon and Xing whitewares. I am far from an expert in these wares, but there is an aesthetic that is quite remarkable. Poet Lu Yu, in his famous The Classic of Tea, was adamant that tea bowls had to be ceramic, and he picks out Yu-ware and Xingware as the best. In writing today on such pottery, Li Jian states that, I quote, "the precision and mastery required to create secret color or meso celadon ware mean that the craftsmen of the period had refined tastes, exceptional pottery making skills, and truly inspired creative impulses." And jumping now to a quite different tradition, what about the aesthetic of Kamara's ware from Middle Bronze Age Crete? We have little problem considering their aesthetic qualities when presented in a museum, and imagining their impact in the acts of consumption for which they were initially designed. However, their technique of manufacture is excluded from such considerations. It is these wares that are among the first to be wheel-made on Crete, though we typically think of this dimension as mechanical or economic rather than aesthetic. But why imagine that a mechanical rather than a thinking, expressive hand lay behind their construction? Was not the potter quite conscious of the consumption contexts, perhaps grand feasts, for which their wares were destined, and of the associations with other media, with other thinking hands making objects in metal, stone, and other media? The point is that the wheel may have been as expressive and soulful as imagined for the makers of celadon wares. Can we not think that the artisans in question in both cases had gone beyond the mechanics of technique in some way? The instrument of the wheel may not have preoccupied them enormously. So let us ask, more broadly then, what were such artisans trying to achieve? There is a very simple point we overlook, and which can nonetheless be useful to make. Yes, in these cases we may be talking about tablewares of various kinds, but more fundamentally still, we are looking at the creation of containers, of vessels that contain. We might evoke here Heidegger's poetic account of the jug and how it holds. What the potter makes with the jug is a void, he says. Zoe Sophia has a very interesting paper on container technologies, in which he applauds Heidegger for actually thinking about this kind of technology, so often overlooked as passive and indeed as feminine. These are powerful biases that have held us back in contemplating vessels, containers, containing, and holding. Thinking about vessels and containing more explicitly is one step, but there is a further step. Sophia stresses, following Heidegger, that the jug implies not only receiving and holding, but also outpouring. The contents ultimately gush out and are retrieved. The jug also supplies. Here is where we need to then also consider the spout, and indeed the handle. Simmel, writing a century ago, wrote interestingly about the latter in particular, the handle, and how we might think of both handle and spout as reaching out into the world in the context of supply. The handle also suggests that the void is movable, transportable to some degree, a portable void. To handles and spouts we might add lids, as accessories of some kind, which nonetheless play key roles in this nexus of receiving, holding, and supplying, in the sense of how the void, that which the potter is truly making, is experienced in use. And evidently potters do not just make jugs. The neckless, handleless, and spoutless bowls and dishes that are so common in tang and songwares embody a very different nexus of receive, hold, and supply. With the creation of a vessel, walls enclosing a void, we are faced with an outside and an inside. Often the outside and inside do not contain the same elemental media. Inside will be liquid and outside air, or perhaps even fire, a plasma. This sense of the media involved, the media to be separated, must also inform the thinking hand of the craftsman. How absolutely are these media to be separated, and for how long? How thick and impermeable should the walls be? Do inside and outside need to be in touch to some degree? And the aesthetics of this creation of volume seems often to be informed by other technologies in play. It's unlikely that clay is the only material used to contain. What of organic containers, or metal, glass, files, or stone? The aesthetic constellation varies by context, and the choice of clay presumably takes on meaning in some way within the wider aesthetic ecology. With Tang Celadon wares, the greenish tinge was likened to jade, and Xing whitewares were thought similar to silver. With Kamara's ware, the influence of metalwork on the thin walls, strap handles, carinations, and other features is frequently noted. Surely the thinking hand navigates between all of these variables. So there is a broader aesthetic universe in which wheel technology lives in any given social context. It's not as if disciplines working with techniques are unaware of this wider context. The French tradition of the anthropology of techniques, with scholars like Pierre Lemonnier, who we've already mentioned, and Ludovic Coupeil, and on which many of us draw, does have an aesthetic outlook with connections to the anthropology of art. I would suggest that this outlook is not so far, really, from the cognitive outlook espoused in Sanders' 1993 piece that I spoke about before. And there's another tradition, one that we rarely draw on in archaeology, that of cultural techniques, which resides within media studies. Think Marshall McLuhan, Friedrich Hitler, and especially Bernhard Siegert, the cover of whose book on cultural techniques you see here. The emphasis here is much more strongly on communication and how things like doors, and indeed door handles, operate within a communicative aesthetic. I'm not sure what this latter tradition would make of wheel techniques, but I suspect they would foreground their communicative and aesthetic dimensions. And we could actually go back to some of the work some decades ago in archaeology that actively recognized technological aesthetics. Cyril Smith wrote in this way about metallurgy in the 1970s, as did Heather Lechtman, and a little later Dorothy Hostler. It's interesting that metallurgical techniques in particular attracted this kind of thinking. Nevertheless, such archaeological work on techniques seems closer to the anthropological and media approach to techniques than does some of our work here on pottery techniques. And it successfully avoids, I think, the charge of instrumental thinking that can come when we use chaîne opératoire too mechanically. How can we talk about the traces that hands make without any sense of what those hands were trying to achieve? This idea of the thinking hand from the work of Palasma has been taken up by Joe Sofer in very interesting ways in tackling questions of creativity, and one might also mention here the fascinating work recently of Lambros Maliforos, working on his new project called Handmade. So there are choices involved in making vessels, in forming containers that are really voids, and choices too in the selection of materials to do this. Why clay? But then how is a potter to conceptualize that void and its malleable, messy clay containment? As incrementally formed through segments, let's say coils, as made in a process that excludes the craftsperson to some degree, as mold making does, or through a process of making a void from a single mass of clay through the harnessing of rotative kinetic energy. Each of these choices surely says something about the conception of that void and about the wider aesthetic world. Making a void from a single smooth action is perhaps like making glass. What is coiling most like? Is it piecemeal in a way like carving is? I'm only raising these questions here briefly and loosely, but let me mention again Sanders' 1993 paper, in which he actually discusses similar matters, identifying shape as a fundamental element in the, I quote, conceptualization of a tradition. Indeed, void is much too generic when there are so many shapes adapted to that problem. Sander refers particularly to the work of Hélène Balfet among Kabyle potters, where shape is quite differently conceptualized within coiling versus wheel traditions. He identifies topology, partonomy, and sequence as, I quote, fundamental conceptual anchors of any pottery-making tradition. In relation to topology, he asks, is a shape seen as a horizontal one or a vertical one? Is the shape, for example, viewed as a transformation of a sphere, of a cone, or of a cylinder? Is the transformation a case of stretching or of compressing? What is the inside of the vessel and what the outside? Or are the two not distinguished? Sanders' perspective here is, I think, conceptual, but I believe it might easily also be read as broadly aesthetic. Indeed, he goes on to say that they, i.e. topology, partonomy, and sequence, are the aspects which link pottery making to other aspects of culture, other techniques. They underlie the ways in which a particular culture deals with the problems which it encounters in the material world, and as such are part of the cognitive structure of the problem space of that culture. End quote. And within this arguably aesthetic outlook towards different acts of making with the hand, how can we account for changes in such techniques when communities of craftspeople have a long lineage of one technique and then for some reason switch to another? Such a change in the Bronze Age Aegean, and let's say particularly on Crete, has typically been seen in a certain way in terms of efficiency. And even when social context is given fuller consideration, the balance shifts too far to social constructivism. But what of the cultural and aesthetic context? Surely this change tells us a lot that we've not really considered about changing aesthetics. The wheel is always left out of such interpretations, while we can quite clearly see a whole new level of cross-craft interaction in the finished products themselves. why not include the forming technology itself? Finally, I would like to emphasize the importance of the thinking hand and its sense of direction and purpose, which might elude us experimentally. We can create models, but they will only ever be approximative. I feel that we need to recognize the model-making character of this enterprise more explicitly, and use the implicit limitations of models to contemplate what it is we are missing when we treat hands as mechanical devices. Meanwhile, research on violin-playing robots continues, with efforts to include expression in their repertoire. Thank you very much.